Hi, welcome to the Dieku podcast. I'm Gary Snow, and joining me today is Shannon Appelcline, the historian and author of Designers and Dragons. And there's already 4 issues of this, and phenomenal work that Shannon has put in as far as the history of role-playing games, and continuing to make more and more issues in the future. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. But from right now, Shannon, welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here. Thanks for having me, Gary.
And so what we're going to do today is a bit of a year in review, and no better person to actually talk about that than Shannon, because he's got so many years to kind of compare to. So Shannon, right off the bat, what's the state of the industry?
I'd say the state of the industry is a lot better than I would have expected. I mean, we're 2 years into a pandemic now. We've had all kinds of problems that I know we're going to talk about, and we're still getting people publishing things. If anything, I think we're seeing improved sales. We're getting people continuing to play online. We're getting the reemergence of conventions. It's been really good. Kickstarter has been seeing sky high numbers for role-playing products like I've never seen before. I can only imagine what the industry would have been doing if we didn't have this pandemic, because it seems pretty healthy to me right now. And that's a big change from a decade ago.
And you mentioned conventions. Just talk about, like, what's the state of conventions? How many have kind of been either going in limping or like a pseudo hybrid model?
Well, I think the best one we can look at is Gen Con, because Peter Adkison is one of the most kind of open and transparent about how things are going on. There was an in-person convention that I believe was supported by some virtual this year, and they had a turnout of 40,000, I think, about half of what they had 2 years ago, which I think is pretty astounding for where we are right now. We had most of our conventions go off in September. We had one of the PAXs, we had Gen Con, and then we had Origins, I think, start just at the end of the year. And so it all kind of got pushed back. It all got kind of mushed together. I'm sure that impacted people's ability to go because they were all together. I know some publishers were not willing to go to all of them because they were afraid they would be potential disease vectors from one place to another, because they were all like within 14-day windows from one to the other to the other. But they happened. They seemed to work. There were no super spreader events. So it seems that they were done safe enough. So successful. Big change from the start of the year when we were all virtual. And I think we're going to be continuing this into 2022, though it's, of course, hard to say with Omicron out there.
Do you think conventions still have the same kind of place in the industry as they used to have, or is it declining with more and more like Kickstarter and digital?
I would say it's very much not declining. I mean, we are seeing the numbers of Gen Con, they've been skyrocketing year by year until the last 2 years, of course. We've seen the whole PAX series of conventions appear. There is, I think, so much more interest in in-person gaming with people from all across your area, your region, the country, the world, than there ever was before. I think a lot of that has to do with the innate growth of the industry that we've been seeing. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact there's a lot more kind of mass appeal for role-playing games. And so there may be people going out there who, haven't necessarily done a lot of gaming and they want to see more of it. You say, do they have the same place in the industry? And I'm not sure that's quite the same. Conventions were really the only place the tribe could meet in the 70s and 80s. They were the only place you could find out about new games, about other than the magazines. See how other people actually played. The role-playing industry was much more fractured and, in separate little regional enclaves in the 70s in particular than it is now. And so the conventions were how they came together. And I don't think there's that same need for the communication, because we do see it on Kickstarter and other things like you mentioned now, but they're no less, they are much more popular, in fact.
And then I guess an offshoot of that is like just the whole printing process. And across North America and even the globe, there's logistics problems and printing problems. And how has that been impacting the industry?
I think it has the potential to horribly impact the industry. One of the biggest problems that we've seen is that shipping costs have dramatically skyrocketed. And when I say dramatically, I mean some role-playing publishers are seeing their shipping costs up 10 times over what they were a year or two ago. And our industry does not have very good margins. It has paper thin margins, profit margins. And so I don't know how publishers are absorbing these additional costs right now. I don't know how they're going to in the future. I am fairly shocked that we have not seen a wave of companies going out of business, a wave of failed Kickstarters, but we haven't. Certainly, it's also slowing things down. I think the worst story that I saw, really underlining how stupid a lot of the logistical problems were, came out of Long Beach, which is one of the big ports into the US. It's where a lot of the stuff from China is coming in. So that means it's where a lot of the role-playing products are coming in, because your full color books are probably being printed somewhere in Asia. And Long Beach had a law that said that you could not have containers stacked more than 2 high because it was unaesthetic, Southern California. And so they had come to a complete gridlock where they could not get things off of boats because everything was stacked too high. And all of the trucks, which were supposed to be moving the containers, they all had containers on them, empty containers mostly, but they couldn't stack them anywhere. And so everything was just stopped until someone went through, did kind of a fake tour to discover what he already knew, which was this was the problem, put out on Twitter, got it retweeted by a lot of people. And the next day, the Long Beach City Council made a law that temporarily you could stack things higher than 2. And some of the logistics started getting better. It's still going to be a big problem going into 2022 because all of the boats are in the wrong place. We, had a huge influx of boats coming from Asia to here, and, they're all in the wrong place now. And that's much of what has, put the costs up. At least it's a little better, but I think that's the worst problem. And I could still see it driving major publishers out of business if there's not a lot of care. Thankfully, people learned after the first batch of Kickstarters that they had to put at least some of the shipping and handling cost off to the buyers, no matter what they ended up being, because there was some variability in the first couple of years that did knock some publishers out of business. But hopefully we won't see that. But I think that's the biggest problem that the pandemic's causing right now.
And then I would assume that might lead to more people willingness to go to digital just overall in their orders so that they can get items a little bit more quickly in their hands and be able to be used. And one of the games that was produced was the Monty Cook Darkest House. And that's kind of like a HTML website hybrid kind of adventure, and that's kind of the first one that I think I've seen. I mean, there's probably some smaller ones, but that's probably one from the bigger companies.
Yeah, I think the Darkest House from Monty Cook's company is, I would say, the first and possibly only pandemic game. A game really produced to answer some of the solutions to the pandemic. It's got kind of a universal system. It's got, as you said, an HTML-ish interface where you can kind of move from room to room. It's got its books fully available as PDFs. It, I think, was really a thoughtful way to say, how could we produce a game that doesn't just run online, but was created to run online? It's kind of a neat experiment. The reviews of it seem to have been fairly good. And, I think we're going to probably see more of it. It's been great to see that type of creativity.
Do you think it almost is like that step towards video games, that it's like, I mean, the lines are blurring between?
The lines are blurring. I don't know exactly how much the big virtual tabletop explosion that we've seen during the pandemic is going to hold out to when people can get back to their, new tabletops. I mean, I've certainly been playing a lot of virtual tabletop board games since then, less so than role-playing games. And I don't know if that's going to continue. I think a couple of years, people are going to have to make a reassessment and say, hey, was this something that we did just because of the pandemic, or was it something that's really offered a totally new way to role play that wasn't available to us before? And I don't know what that answer is going to be. I don't know what everyone's personal interest is going to be. I do know that 20 years ago, we'd have a member of our gaming group move across the country, and we'd talk about, oh, how can we bring them in, with video calls or stuff. It would never work out. Might that be different now? It's hard to say. It's really hard, I think, still to merge a physical tabletop with a virtual tabletop. I just bring a couple of people in. I don't think I've seen that change, because that, of course, hasn't been a priority in the pandemic. But I think there's really going to be a wait and see. But especially with the virtual tabletops, I think we've seen some evidence that maybe we've topped out at capacity already, that the number of people who want to do it is not increasing anymore. Though Roll20 was still reporting increases in size, at least in the first quarter. I don't think their later reports said if they were getting bigger or not still.
And it seems that it's becoming a very crowded field. I saw that Astral Tabletop, virtual tabletop, ceased, and that they're just going to close things out eventually. And that was a partnership with DriveThruRPG, which makes me wonder how those work together now.
Yeah, that Astral, basically the main designer developer, said he wasn't going to do any more work on it, which is kind of a 1 or 2 year out death knell for a online product. That was the thing that really made me think, wow, it's like we've maxed out capacity there, because he said he didn't do it just because he couldn't get critical mass. And as you said, he had a partnership with DriveThruRPG. He had, potentially all of the advertising, all of the attention that he wanted, and he couldn't get enough people on there. They were at Roll20, whatever other ones. They weren't willing to come over. Certainly online games always have a problem with critical mass, and whether you have to have enough people to get enough people. Maybe it was just that, but I have a suspicion that people were starting to go back to the tabletops already, the physical tabletops, and that I think his announcement was in November or something, that by this point we may have reached peak of virtual tabletops, and we may not be doing more there. Hard to say.
And then despite that, there's the Demi playing virtual tabletop, who is now developing the equivalent of D&D Beyond for Paizo. And they announced that I think it's going to be out next year for the Paizo's Nexus platform. And I guess, what's your thoughts on that? Are they heading in the right direction, or is it just to compete with D&D Beyond?
It's hard to say. I mean, I wonder how D&D Beyond is doing compared to, Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds. Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds seem to have all of the oxygen in the room. They seem to get all the attention. I'm surprised every once in a while when I look and remember, yeah, D&D Beyond, that's around, but they could easily be much, much larger just because of the D&D base. Paizo doing their own. I think they're probably still the number 2 role-playing company. If so, that's probably a great way to lock in their audience, and they're probably the other publisher that's big enough to really have that make sense. I don't think I'd say anyone else is. Maybe Frelingen, because they have so many different games. But I think there's always a question there. Do you want to go off into your own little, gated garden, or do you want to be out there with all of the other publishers? And you see constantly in the industry these different decisions of, yes, I think I can do better in my own category, or I really need to be out with all of these other people. And so Paizo, yeah, they're probably good if they can actually produce it. Wizards of the Coast had years of failure in producing a virtual tabletop. Paizo failed with their first big online game they were going to do with Goblin Works. Online, massive user things are really, really tough to do. And so the question is going to be, do they have a product out in a year? If so, then it was probably a good idea. Or is this going to be another multi-year fiasco, in which case it probably wasn't.
And then kind of an offshoot about that, as far as playing online, you have Critical Role and other streamers that are actually doing live play, and they've had a big influence on the industry and just the hobby in general.
My general opinion is that the streamers are one of the 2 or 3 major advances in the industry in the 10s that made it so successful. I think, Critical Role and the many other podcasts, videocast streamers, etc. I think they were hugely influential in making D&D 5e as successful as it is, which I think Wizards realized when they put out their Stream of Annihilation in 2016, 17, which was their first really big recognition and really putting their force behind it all. Hugely, hugely successful. One of the interesting bits of info that came out this year was that Critical Role is making $5 million a year, averaged over 2 recent years, which is pretty successful. I mean, they got a big team. They're very professional production. I don't think they're rolling in money or anything, but the fact that they can run what's effectively a medium-sized role-playing company off of streaming revenues, that's terrific. I was really enthused to see how successful they're doing, given how much they have, pulled up the whole industry with them.
And then there's D&D Live, and I can't help when I watch that. It's almost like watching like NFL football. That like it's pretty high-end production, and when they do those types of shows, and it's amazing. Like just like esports, like it's amazing how far these kind of niche hobbies have grown to become mainstream.
Yeah, I really think we're in a mainstream place of role playing right now, more so than we have been at any point in the industry's history. And D&D Live was especially interesting because this year's was broadcast on Peacock. I mean, Peacock's kind of the newest major-ish streaming platform. I'm sure they were desperate for content since all the rest, other than who is that? ABC? NBC, whoever it is, all of the content except their own was locked up elsewhere since there were so many other. But the fact that a streaming platform for one of the major networks in the U.S. broadcast D&D Live, that speaks volumes to how much the whole industry, the role playing, has gone mass market.
And I saw also that Warhammer Plus I think it's called Warhammer Plus, started their own streaming service with 11 animation series in the queue. And I mean, that also kind of speaks volumes to it's becoming more of a media company than just a role-playing game company.
Yeah. Well, Games Workshop has been one of the most professional companies, perhaps one of the most corporate companies in the industry for a long time. They're right up there with Wizards of the Coast as the other company. They're, publicly owned. They have pushed hard on their miniatures, and so they're not quite in role playing in the same way. But they're really big, and the fact that they started a streaming channel, not as big as many of the other ones we were talking about, that's pretty cool. Though they also kind of shot themselves in the foot from day one by saying, okay, we're going to do all these animated shows, and if you're doing animated shows on YouTube right now, you have to stop earning money from them or bring them over to us. And their fandom did not like that very much, and that has also always been Game Workshop's big dilemma there. They are corporate enough that they've been very successful, and they are corporate enough that they have more than once made fans and or other people in the industry unhappy through their stores, their exclusives, and now going after their own fans for producing content.
And I think World of Darkness also has a series in the works.
Yeah, I've heard about two possible series. One's the World of Darkness that you mentioned, which is movies and TV. And, the last World of Darkness TV show didn't go that well, but that was back in the 90s and kind of well before peak golden age of TV. The other one's D&D, where I was surprised to hear them say pretty recently that the movie's going to be tied into TV shows. So we'll see how that goes. D&D movies don't have a great record either, but the animated series from the 80s still holds up decently well as a kid's series. I watched some episodes recently, and they're still pretty fun.
Well, I mean, now that CGI is what it is, and there's more of an acceptance of the hobby in general, like the budgets are higher, the special effects are higher, and it just really helps to bring these kind of fantastic stories to life, just like the Marvel superheroes. I mean, do you remember those 80s Marvel superhero movies, how bad they were? Like, I mean, really bad.
Yeah. And I remember even more the 70s or so TV shows, which had this kind of stop type of animation. Not great. So yeah, there has been a big change. As I said, in part, I think that's peak TV, but also you're right. I think Game of Thrones did a lot to make it possible to do great fantasy series. I mean, we have the Wheel of Time now, which I've been hearing mixed reviews on, but it's certainly the type of thing that would not have been made a while ago. We've got Second Age, Lord of the Rings series coming out soon. So there's a lot out there, and certainly new D&D TV shows, movies, whatever, have the potential to, be high quality, and we'll have to see. But I do have a lot more faith in TV shows now than I did in the 80s.
And so now going on to the next step of like kind of what's hot in the industry, like what kind of companies are doing things right? What are you seeing out there as far as when you compare it to the long term of role-playing games in general or tabletop games in general? Who's doing good out there?
Well, we always have ICV2 to look at to kind of give us some rough indication, at least what's going on in retailer stores. And so they have listed recently as their top ones, D&D 5e, no surprise there. D&D's always been the industry leader with a few little hiccups. We have Pathfinder. It's always been unclear to me how Pathfinder 2e's done versus 1e, but Pathfinder's definitely up there. We have Cyberpunk Red now, and that's primarily, I think, due to interest in the computer game that came out last year now, I guess. But the interesting thing about that is it actually seems to have had crossover into the role-playing industry. You mentioned the Marvel movies, and they're another example of kind of licensing off of a smaller industry. And again, I've heard over the Marvel movies that they get huge interest in the movies and they get very little crossover into comic shops afterward. They just don't see that same success in the series. So the fact that Cyberpunk Red came out as a video game and suddenly the role-playing game's doing a lot better, that says that we might have a lot more success in our industry licensing things out for whatever reason. And possibly, my favorite success story of the 10s going into the 20s now is the whole Swedish scene, and how we have these Swedish role-playing companies that got started in the 80s, building off of Chaosium's BRP, kind of building a whole industry off of that. And they're kind of all of the foreign from the US at least, role-playing scenes, one of the ones that really I think was the most, creative in producing so much of their own content. And now, primarily thanks to Fria Ling and the Free League, they're doing magnificent on the international scene. I would easily place them in a top 10 role-playing companies, maybe top 4. One of the recent ICV2s, which listed games instead of companies, put Alien, which is one of their newest games, at number 4, I think. So I think those are all pretty hot companies. We, of course, have had the OSR continue to do very well. Worlds Without Number, which was the new fantasy game from the company that did Stars Without Number, Cinnamone.
Kevin Crawford's company.
Yeah. I believe they are the top fantasy role-playing product being sold by DriveThruRPG this last year, other than D&D itself, of course. I also have kind of fallen in love with Necrotic Gnome, who did Old School Essentials, which they finally got some of their books back into print this year after problems due to a combination of Brexit and the pandemic, which kind of kept them locked up in their England warehouses for a while. So it's been really great to see the OSR, which, was a fan movement in the odd aughts and, became a publishing movement in the 10s. And now in the 20s, it's, a mainstream publishing movement. The other big publishing movement from those periods, of course, was the indie movement. And frankly, I have trouble seeing the indie movement anymore, not because it's faded away, but because it's, become so mainstream. The biggest Kickstarter of the year for Avatar Legends from Magpie Games, they were an indie publisher. Is that one still indie or not? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and then I guess speaking of Kickstarter and speaking of indies and success, like Mothership, I could not believe they achieved the success that they achieved, and Kickstarter in general just being such a good avenue for indie publishers and big companies as well. I mean, it's basically become a pre-order system.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges in role-playing production has always been figuring out print runs. The rule of thumb I learned when I worked for Chaosium back in the 90s was that you wanted to publish a print run in which you sold half of your print run on the pre-order. You got them into house, you immediately sent out half. And that meant you paid for your print run, you immediately got all of your cash back to do the next print run. And then you had, this long tail of sales that would continue on for the rest to continue funding, staff and all of the rest. But that's a really hard guess to make, especially if you don't have a, existing fan based existing line. And so publishers, it's not just that they've been using it for pre-orders, but for pre-orders so that they know how much to print and they can make that accurate. And like I said, there were some real problems in the first years of Kickstarters, primarily related to international shipping, that got a lot of publishers in trouble. But now I think it's really turned into a huge boon. And this last year, I've never seen anything like it. I've been kind of looking at the top Kickstarters since 2011. And 2011, I wrote a yearly report in which I said, wow, we had a company that made $30,000 on a Kickstarter. That was due from Evil Hat. And the next year I was like, wow, we have 11 or something like that made over 100,000. This year we had 11 Kickstarters that meet my tight definition of a role-playing game, i.e. not dice, not miniatures, not accessories, that made over $1 million. And like I said, the first one, Avatar Legends, it made $8 million and it had 80,000 patrons, backers. There were 10 others that made over $1 million. One or two of them made $2 million. And every single one of them had at least 10,000 backers. Back in the day when Evil Hat did their Fate Core, 2000, I don't know, 13, 14, 15, whenever it was, they were the first company, I'm pretty sure, in the role-playing to hit 10,000 backers when other people were hitting 2, 3, 4 for a successful Kickstarter. And it was, only with extreme effort. They offered like cheap PDFs and that to get people and get them interested. The fact that we had 11 that made 10,000 this year and all made more than $1 million, it's outstandingly successful. And even though most of it was D&D 5e products, which again speaks to how successful Wizards is right now, we had Avatar Legends from Magpie. We had Mothership, which you mentioned, and they're an example of how to do a Kickstarter really successful, because Mothership originally came out in 2018. This was kind of the expansion, the professional version. But I think that's what's required for a successful Kickstarter. You have to spend years getting ready for it. Way back when Dungeon World was the first kind of big Kickstarter in the indie industry, which Mothership is the newest incarnation of that, or maybe Avatar Legends, depending on how you mention it. And they similarly spent years talking to the community, getting the community interested. And, people are still doing that, and they're reaching even higher levels of success for it because of, the higher success of the industry, the higher visibility of Kickstarter, the higher willingness of people to, put money out in front. I think probably we're seeing some pandemic related, people are more willing to put money into Kickstarter because they're not going out to stores. maybe next year or the year after is not going to be quite as amazing. It's pretty amazing right now.
I just actually happen to have the Fate Core 2013. It just happened to be handy here, so that's good.
Yeah, so that must mean it was Kickstarted in 2012, and so that was 10,000 people back in 2012, which was such a big number. But 11 people, probably more than that, doing it now. Those were just the ones that made $1 million off of it.
And then with any kind of industry or any kind of platform, Kickstarter also has its bumps along the way. And speaking of, one is like the Luke Crane incident with the Perfect RPG.
Yeah, the Luke Crane incident with the Perfect RPG was one of those unfortunate bits of history in our industry that I hate writing about. It is in one of my histories that I'm writing now, which we're going to talk about more later. But it goes back to 2019, I think, when Adam Koebel was one of the most successful streamers out there. I mean, not quite Quick Roll successful, but he was doing very well. And
he wrote Dungeon World, had a very active YouTube channel, was streaming games constantly.
Yeah. He was a in-house GM at Roll20 or something like that. And so he was running a science fiction game, actually originally based upon Stars Without Numbers, though it had moved on since then to one of the more generic systems. The system from Fantasy Flight Games, Genesis. And he had a sexual assault in his game, and it hadn't been okayed with the players, and it was all live streamed, and he kind of didn't exactly apologize afterward, but instead talked about the stresses of the live streaming. And so he kind of got canceled, I guess you'd say, from the industry as a result. He'd been working with Luke Crane previously. Burning Wheel headquarters did some of the distribution of Dungeon World when the two principals kind of stepped away from it a little bit because they each had other things going on in their life. And so Luke Crane was a friend of Adam Koebel, and he did this Perfect RPG where the idea was going to be, it was going to be a quick little Kickstarter. He was going to have 20, 30, well-known people in the industry each produce their own, short little RPG. Something that would have gotten a lot of attention, made a lot of people happy. Except he included Adam Koebel in it. He didn't tell anyone else he included Adam Koebel in it. A lot of people wouldn't have wanted to work with Adam Koebel. And like when he listed the people working on the book, it kind of looked like he was maybe trying to hide Adam Koebel's name because he alphabetized them by first name in reverse, which just one of the weirdest things. And so that was certainly one of the big kerfluffles in the industry for the year, though there were certainly others.
And he actually Luke Crane actually worked at Kickstarter at the time. I forget his exact title, but it was like basically community.
That was it. He was community head or something like that. And apparently shortly after that, due to a mutual decision, no longer was, which is kind of a real shame not having our big advocate working at Kickstarter, but it's what happened. So I think the real lesson there, if we kind of want to look at it beyond just the, wow, something bad happened, is, if you're doing Kickstarters, let people know who they're working with. Don't have people that, especially we're aware of the people that, others might not want to work with. If you're running a Kickstarter and you have someone who others might be uncomfortable with, don't just, not let them know.
I guess good for indie game designers, if they're ever in those situations, if they're in an anthology or whatnot, to kind of get the nice parameters of what's happening. So maybe a good advice for things for indie designers to avoid.
Yeah. And I can understand the overall question can be tricky. When you get out of the indie space, at least so much role-playing work is done by huge consortiums of people right now. You can't tell everyone that's working, but you got to know when something is going on that people might not be happy with. Otherwise, you're just going to, kill your whole project like happened here. The project was withdrawn within the day.
So going from Kickstarters and kind of the indie scene and people self-funding, let's go now to the big daddy of them all is Wizards of the Coast, and just talk about, they have such a prominence in our industry. I know lots of people say it's kind of like as they go, we go. So how are they doing, and what's your take on Wizards of the Coast right now?
I think that Wizards of the Coast is doing very well. I think they are very successful, and I think they're doing a pretty decent job of being a leader of the industry, which I would not have said was the case for their predecessor, TSR, who, much more often was at odds with the industry. I mean, the big news for Wizards of the Coast last year was they got promoted at Hasbro, so that now one of the 3 divisions at the very top level in Hasbro is called Wizards and Digital, which is basically Wizards of the Coast also managing digital properties. Hasbro is huge. They're huge. The fact that someone in our industry is considered a major element of their company it's amazing. Some of that's Magic the Gathering, but most of it's Magic the Gathering. Let's be honest. But this year they said part of the reason for the promotion was considerable success and growth in both D&D and Magic, both of them. And it's actually been relatively rare that Hasbro has explicitly discussed D&D at the top level, and this year they were saying D&D is very successful. So that's been great to see. The other thing that I find interesting about Wizards is, I think by choice, it's a little hard to say, they are working hard to, do right by a kind of diversity and kind of the moral arc of the industry. Certainly I've seen complaints, I've seen criticisms. They are, very much a lightning rod because of their position in the industry. But, they put out Candlekeep Mysteries, and they had a wheelchair accessible dungeon there, which, was building on other discussion about disability and dungeons and a miniature that had been done by Sarah Thompson. They have been talking for, I think, a year and a half about, the problems of race in role-playing games. It's been a wider discussion than before that. Don't think that Wizards started it off. It started off as, tens, maybe the odd aughts. But it's about what's called biological essentialism, where they say, the biology of something isn't, necessarily about how they act. And when you muddle these together, when you muddle together biology and culture, you end up with racial stereotypes. And fantasy, pretty much from Tolkien, is kind of built upon that idea. And we're just, kind of starting to step away and say, yeah, culture, biology, those are different things. If we try to say this, they're the same thing, not only do we create games that aren't necessarily as, deep and realistic as they could be, but we also give racists in our real world kind of a leg to stand on, because we say, yeah, you're right. When you're saying these, real world racial groups are different, we're supporting that. And we obviously don't want to do that. So they've stepped up with that. They wrote about, diversity last year. Some of their recent supplements have started to separate culture and biology for races or ancestries or bloodlines or some of the other names that are perhaps better to use, because race has so many connotations in the real world. And this year they said, hey, not all Drow are evil. Saying Drow are evil, that's very much biological essentialism. It's very much saying that psychological, mental, other characteristics are based on biology, which, is not appropriate. And R.A. Salvatore, the biggest writer of Dro ever, was able to immediately support that with Starlight Enclave, his new novel, his first novel in his new series, which, there's still bad Dro. They've been corrupted by Lolth over the years, but there's good Dro too. And we meet some of those in Starlight Enclave and presumably in upcoming D&D supplements.
And then speaking of novels, the Dragonlance Saga, by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, I don't know if some of those same issues played out into that, but that was very prominent at one point that they pulled the plug on a future update of Dragonlance, only to have Wizards of the Coast sued for breach of contract by Margaret and Tracy. And what's your take on that?
Yeah, the lawsuits were weird. There were two major lawsuits last year against Wizards. One of them was the one you mentioned by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. They had basically, Wizards shut down their fiction department 2016 or so, because it's gotten increasingly hard for a company, even Wizards size, to sell into the fiction market. It's gotten very expensive to do so. And so their answer to that was to start licensing books out. And they've only done that twice. One was that they gave Bob Salvatore licenses for Drizzt books, and I think Starlight Enclave was maybe the fourth of them that's been published since that. And the other was that they gave the Dragonlance creators, the main Dragonlance creators, there was a whole team, Weiss and Hickman, a license to publish a new trilogy. And according to the lawsuit, what happened was that there was a good faith editorial right that Wizards had, where Weiss and Hickman, would send them books for approval, and Wizards of the Coast would, in good faith, tell them either they were approved or tell them what needed to be done to make them approved. And Weiss and Hickman would resolve any problems and then publish it. And at least according to the lawsuit, what happened was Wizards at some point said, don't bother sending anymore. We're not going to approve it. No matter what you do, we're done. The other lawsuit had to do with translations from the people doing the accessories, Gale Force 9. And it was even less clear what was going on there, but it apparently was also approval related. And so last year, my take was kind of, what is going on here? Why is Wizards of the Coast suddenly, apparently, according to the lawsuits, not acting in good faith on their licensing agreements? And not sure we ever know why that was. The fact that Wizards, 3, 6, 9 months later was pulled up as one of the main groups at Hasbro suggests to me it might have been related in some way. But this year, in an out-of-court settlement, Weiss and Hickman were able to get the rights that they felt like they already had to actually produce the books. I vaguely recall from Wizards' original statement that they claimed that some of the issues were that maybe there were some stereotypes or something that they didn't like. We've now seen the actual announcement of the book, with the first of which is called Dragons of Despair and is going to be out next Gen Con, it sounds like, next August anyway. And it apparently goes back to Tasselhoff's good old time travel device. And so maybe Weiss and Hickman are planning to do some rebooting of some of what they've done previously, and Wizards wasn't happy with that. Still hard to say. I think we're going to need a book to say for sure. One thing that I found interesting about the book and exciting was, as I said, one of the things Wizards of the Coast is doing that I find very admirable is really their push toward diversity, their push toward, making sure that there aren't prejudiced things in their books. There's a major new character in the new Dragonlance books, and from the cover picture, she is Black, which is, really nice to put foremost. She was right there with Tasselhoff and somewhere else on the new cover. And I think it really speaks to the continuing diversity at Wizards and the things that they're licensing. I'm excited to see the new book. I've always had a soft place in my heart for the Dragonlance books since I read them first in the 80s.
And then you previously mentioned another lawsuit, but the what do we want to call it? Fake TSR, TSR3, and that drama that has been and continues to play out as far as the lapsed trademark and Ernie Gygax. Do you even know where it's going or what? What's going to happen there?
So the whole system with we'll call it TSR3 is unfathomable. It is one of the, I don't know, worst bits of business I've ever seen in our industry that is built upon people who don't really know how to do business that great because they're designers. And so, there have been, in my Designers and Dragons books, I call them dragons. There have been all of these dragons, and I've never seen anything as poorly, I don't know if it's considered as poorly done as what's going on in TSR3. So what they did was back at the tail end of 2020, they filed for trademarks on a bunch of TSR trademarks. The old Lizard Man, the old Block TSR letters, their Dragon TSR, their Wizard TSR. They filed for trademarks on all of these. And they filed these trademarks with an affidavit, an oath that no one else was using them. And they also filed them either with the original artwork, or if not with the original artwork, with artwork that is so close to the original artwork that it's clearly derivative of it. And then they started trying to license these to people in the OSR. No one in the OSR seemed very interested in, putting their foot on that landmine. And so this year they then came back and formed their own company. It was previously the Dungeon Hobby Shop Museum. That was who originally offered the license of these trademarks, which is a museum that's being created in Wisconsin. And then they came back as TSR. Justin Lanasa and Ernie Gygax are the ones who've been really running TSR3. They linked up with Stephen Deinhardt, who had his own company called Wonderfilled, and had previously done a by then overdue Kickstarter for a game called Giant Lands, and they formed this TSR3 company. And at which point they started, putting out all kinds of media that basically suggested we're the original TSR, come back together, which they are nothing of the sort. And, if the licensing of these other trademarks that are kind of questionable wasn't enough to make people think weird and things about them, the fact that they started really acting, or at least marketing themselves like they were the original TSR back, didn't do any better. And by the way, when I say questionable trademarks, there's the two things. First, Wizards of the Coast has claimed that they committed fraud in filing for these trademarks by saying that no one else was using them and that they knew better, which is going to be for the trademark board to decide. And second, because they used copyrights that didn't belong to them for the artwork, or else made derivative things that probably would fall under derivative copyright. So really questionable trademarks before they even got to the fact that they were marketing that they were the original TSR. And then Ernie Gygax did an interview, and he said some things that have been taken as transphobic, and he said some things that came across as directly against the diversity initiatives that Wizards was doing. And it's kind of been followed up by Justin and Stephen. Stephen, I think, was the one that made a very transphobic remark on Twitter. And Justin seems really not to like the diversity. And so he has continually gone on that. And they've shut down their websites. They've brought back the websites. They've broken up so that Stephen has his own company back and has taken Giant Lands back. They said they were going to publish Star Frontiers using another trademark that was in active use by Wizards of the Coast when they filed for it. Wizards of the Coast sent them a cease and desist. They let go of most of their trademarks at that point, but kept, I think, the Lizard Man one. And then they filed a lawsuit against Wizards of the Coast to try and get a court to make declaratory judgment that, yes, they actually owned the trademarks they had, and, would Wizards please stop bullying them? Then it turned out that they didn't know what they were doing, and they filed it in North Carolina, I believe, where Wizards of the Coast actually has no presence. Hasbro has an office there, apparently, but apparently their lawyer didn't understand they were different companies, which sounds not great for a lawyer. And they started a Indiegogo to try and raise money for all of this, which I don't know how the $3,000 or $4,000 that they've raised is going to do anything against Wizards lawyers. And they're claiming they're going to refile it in Seattle, in Washington. And it's just seemed like a train wreck to me. I've omitted the fact that they basically grabbed the trademark out from under the previous company that was using TSR. Jason Elliott, he put out Gygax magazine with Ernie Gygax, as it happens, and also Top Secret New World Order with Merle Rasmussen, the original creator. I have never seen so much potential goodwill squandered in such a short sequence of time. I mean, they could have got out there, they could have said, hey, we're doing this museum, hey, we'd like to produce old school stuff. And instead they turned it into a culture war. And they also, said a lot of things to, self-aggrandize themselves as if they were the original TSR. And it's been a dumpster fire.
Well, obviously it's a bit of a shame for the legacy of Gary Gygax, and I think everybody would be happy if this is kind of probably over and done with in some capacity, and everybody can just kind of move on with things. But it seems like it's one of those things that's just not going to end.
Oh, I think it's going to end. If they actually refile that lawsuit, some of the comments I've seen on the lawsuit from lawyers who looked it over said, remarkably, they were saying, hey, we want you to say not only that we own these trademarks, but also the copyrights, which I don't even know how that would go, because they have nothing to do with any company ever who owned the copyright for those pictures used in the trademarks. And one of the lawyers who I read who wrote about it said, by invoking the copyrights, not just the trademarks, they've kind of gone into this other place in law where Wizards can come back and ask them for all of their costs for the lawsuit. So if they lose the lawsuit, not only do they lose their trademark, not only do they have to have paid out for any lawyers that they have, but they also have to pay out, one would suspect, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars for Wizards lawyers. So if it actually does get refiled in Washington, and if it actually does have the same stuff about copyright that the last did, they could easily be bankrupt by next year. I don't see how they have any of their TSR trademarks by next year in any case, because my totally non-legal opinion is I suspect they're not going to be able to keep them. I suspect that they probably don't have the rights to them. But even if they did, I don't think that they have lawyers that could go up against Wizards of the Coast. And unfortunately, in our country, he who has the most expensive lawyers is often the winner.
And then speaking of other kind of, I guess, business side of things, Paizo and their unionization, how did that kind of play out in your eyes?
Well, the role-playing industry has always been horribly underpaid. Much like the video game industry, people are very excited to work in it, and because they're excited to work in it, they're often willing to work long hours for no pay. I worked in the industry for 2 years in the 90s, and eventually had to quit because I was running out of money, because I was supporting myself with my savings while working in the industry, which I suspect is not entirely uncommon. I was getting a salary, just not much of one. So one would hope that that is not as much of an issue at the big publishers. Wizards of the Coast, Paizo at least, they are both big enough and successful enough that one would think should be able to pay reasonable wages. But this year there was a very long Twitter thread by Jessica Price in which she felt finally able to talk about the problems that she had experienced at Paizo when she was working there, because the last people who she'd felt could be damaged if she talked about them had just been laid off. And it went everywhere. And it talked, among other things, about a company that, at least in her eyes, was very, very cheap. I think the thing that struck me and that struck many people the most was that they did not clean their carpets for years and years and years, to the point where people were having, like breathing difficulties and getting sick because of it, which if that's actually the case, that goes right up there with the whole TSR3 story as one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard in the industry. But I would believe it too, just based on how I've seen some publishers run. Also in it, and the thing that was kind of the least dramatic, but possibly the most important, was that the people there were underpaid, especially for the fact that they were working in, Seattle, Washington, a very expensive area. And so I am pretty sure that that's what directly led to the decision of Paizo employees to seek a union. First in the industry, at least first in the industry for a direct role-playing company of that size. Maybe there's something else in board gaming or something. I don't know of it. We'll call it the first in the industry. And the other thing that I thought was very amazing and really spoke to, I think, a lot of the labor organization that was very common in the US in the 1900s and less so in more recent decades, was after the Paizo employees took their vote and decided to unionize, there was a sudden work stoppage among freelancers at Paizo, where basically they put their freelance careers on the line and said, we're not going to hand in our products until, this problem is resolved. I've said the industry is on, narrow margins. I've said that people aren't paid enough. Anyone working freelance in the industry, they're not making much money. They're doing it out of love. And they don't necessarily have a huge amounts of opportunity for good paying companies, because there aren't a lot of companies that are, really offering the professional rates that you could, that you'd need to make a living off of it. So the fact that they were willing to stop work, to not hand in manuscripts, to choose to not fulfill their contracts to try and help, the people who actually were employed at the company, it's one of the best things I've ever seen in the industry. Paizo voluntarily recognized the union. I don't think I've heard anything about the negotiations going on. It's very historic. It's very unfortunate that it was let off with, this litany of problems that were revealed at Paizo. But the fact that there's now some people in the industry with some power that won't just be taken advantage of because they're doing a job that they love, I think that's very important.
And I mean, just you even talking about that, and I think it's very similar to other industries, like the film industry, as an example of, people get stars in their eyes and they have a passion for whether it's telling stories or designing role-playing games or whatever the case might be, that they are willing to sacrifice almost anything in order to get a successful career within that industry. So you see it all the time where people get taken advantage of because there's somebody always right behind them to replace them. And this is like the fact that those freelancers were, holding out is maybe a sign of a bit of a change.
Yeah, I think so. And I should be clear, whole industry isn't like that. Paizo may not be like that. Paizo, one way or another voluntarily decided to recognize the union. They could have tried to fight it and they chose not to. When I was fine, when I was working at Chaosium, I said, I wasn't making much money, but they were adamant that the work week was 40 hours and not a minute more. That, you put down your pen, got off your computer, maybe you went and gamed in the loft with your friends at work afterward, but you didn't keep working. So, I think there's certainly a lot of the industry that, even though people have stars in your eye, as you said, don't take advantage of that to the best of their ability.
And a few other, I guess, companies, just to kind of cover off some things. We already talked about Free League being just on a complete roll of things as far as like success stories, and they seem to be trending really high. Then you mentioned earlier when we talked about some of the old classics coming back.
Yeah, it's been a trend I've seen throughout the 10s and into the 20s, and maybe I'm seeing a little bit less of it now. But, Land of the Rising Sun came out. So that's Lee Gold's old, Asian role-playing game that was first out in 82 or something. Lee Gold, I would mark as one of the most influential women in the industry because she created Alarms and Excursions, Apazine that is still running today. And that has throughout its lifetime seen many discussions from many game designers that would go on to impact their games that they produced. So it was great to see a new edition of that. It's a chivalry and sorcery game. And so it's from Britannia. And Flying Buffalo kind of is coming back. We unfortunately lost Rick Loomis a few years ago. But we're now seeing new Tunnels and Trolls content, and we're seeing, it coming from a new incarnation of Flying Buffalo. Chaosium is always one of my touchstones in the industry because I've been a fan from way back, and it's great to see them doing very well, year over year. They came under new management several years ago now. And they've been doing spectacularly well. In fact, we were talking about DriveThruRPG more than once. And they've been doing great in community content there.
And it seems to be community content is just like instrumental now. And like going back to the Mothership piece of it, like that third-party community content that's being developed really helps build, obviously, the community so that when you do sell a product, you have a hardcore fan base and designers that are willing to put forward new material and keep it vibrant. Yeah,
I've been entirely amazed by how professional so much of the work is on community content. I mean, clearly there's a spectrum, but there was a spectrum, in what was being produced by small press, whatever you called it in the 70s and the 80s before the industry got entirely professional. And some of the stuff I see created for community content is at least as professional as what's being published by the actual publishers. And I think we mostly entirely have Wizards of the Coast to thank for what's, I think, a totally revolutionary way in how things are being published, because they came out with D&D Classics kind of during the interim between 4E and 5E. Which was all of their PDFs of old products. And then that translated into DM's Guild in 2016, which now they suddenly said, hey, any of you can produce content in our worlds too as PDFs. And, it was originally D&D, Forgotten Realms, and has slowly expanded into other settings. And since then, there have been dozens of other publishers who have created community content of their own. And this year, one of the things that really surprised me was I saw some individual creators, because individual creators have really been the heart of most of the community content, say, hey, we're forming a little company and we want to publish community content for DM's Guild and for Miskatonic Repository, I think it's called, the Call of Cthulhu one. And that was kind of a first, that we now have publishers appearing that are there just to create community content, not to take anything away from the individuals, since so many of them are, just as professional as anything else. And I think possibly the only reason they don't have a publishing name is just because it all goes out through DM's Guild or whatever. But, what we saw in the 70s, which were all of these kind of individuals starting up their own companies to publish content for D&D originally and variations of it and such. It's the same thing as the community content in the 10s and 20s, except there's more of it. It's more professional. It's, looks nicer. It's better written, and it's more available. It's I really think the future of game design, if you're not a medium-sized publisher yourself.
And so we've covered a lot of turf over this last year. And before we get your predictions on the upcoming year, tell us, what have you been up to and what's in the future for you?
Yeah, so 2 years ago, just before the pandemic, I made some major life changes. I moved to Hawaii and I quit my full-time job so that I could spend more time writing. Some of that goes to technical writing because I still need to pay the bills, but 2 or 3 days a week now I try and sit down and work on role-playing projects. I wrote a supplement for Chaosium's RuneQuest this year, on elves, which has been a long interest. But the vast majority of my time has gone to Designers and Dragons. As you said, there were 4 books that came out some years ago. My original volumes on the 70s, 80s, 90s, and odd aughts. And I'm now working on 3 new books. Yeah. One of them is the 10s, which is the most requested book since the others came out. People pretty much wanted to see it on January 1st, 2020, I think. I'm giving it a little more time to breathe because I kind of need to see what companies, that were just emerging in the last few years were successful and what weren't. For example, Osprey got into role-playing publishing with their first book published like on December 24th, 2019 or something, somewhere around there. And so that's a company that if I released it on January 1st, 2020, I wouldn't have been able to say anything about. I've got about a little more than a third of that book now. But I'm also working on 2 books of lost histories, which I'm going back to 70s, 80s, 90s, and odd aughts, and I'm writing about a bunch of the companies that I didn't write about the first time. So, for example, the one in front of me at this very moment is Timeline Limited, who did the Morrow Project in 1980, kind of the first military role-playing game, second-ish post-apocalyptic game after Gamma World, and also a much more serious take than Gamma World. Someone that was included in about a page in the original, and so it will be out to a full article. And there's just a lot of other ones. Britannia Games, I mentioned, who's doing Chivalry and Sorcery. They're another one in there. Many others. A lot of them, people that I found pretty important and just got missed the first time. So that's one big project. My hope is that maybe I'll have those 3 books ready to go in 2023. Probably a new Kickstarter for a 3-book series. The other thing that I'm working on are what I call my TSR codices. When D&D Classics first appeared, Steve White approached me and at DriveThruRPG approached me and said, hey, we got the secret project we're going to do. We're going to be making all of the PDFs available for the entire D&D catalog going back to 1974, 1971, really. I think they have chainmail there now. We'd like you to write histories for them. One other person was doing it at the time too, Kevin Kolp. And so we kind of divided up the world, and I wrote all the classic stuff and he wrote all the newer stuff. But when I started that work with DriveThruRPG, I worked really hard to make sure I retained rights to all of my histories. And it was work to figure out how, we could compromise to get everything everyone wanted. DriveThruRPG was great. And they were willing to do it while they were right in the middle of this big initiative to start getting all these books digitized. They were willing to let me hold on to the rights to my history. So I started to compile those into books. And I originally thought, hey, nice 4-book series. That'll be fun. I'll need to fill in the gaps. But for the stuff that Kevin did originally, I found out that I'd actually written about 1 million words just in the content that I'd written over the years. Yeah. And so what I'm actually working on right now is a 4-book series that covers original D&D, AD&D first edition, basic D&D, and kind of the last little bit of basic D&D, which was published as Mystara in AD&D second edition. And so that'll give me kind of a everything up to 1989. That's mostly my stop point, but then there was a little basic D&D that went over into 1993 or so. So that's actually going to be a 4-book series. I finished the first 2. So I have 2 books on everything OD&D and AD&D first edition. And in the new year, I'm going to start on basic D&D. And some of that is, revising, editing, normalizing all of the work that I'd done already. Some of it's filling in gaps. A lot of it depends on when I wrote it. First ones I wrote were shorter, later ones I wrote were longer, and I'm kind of settling on the longer one. So that's an exciting 4-book series that I'm hoping to release in 2024, which will be the 50th anniversary of D&D. And so talking about its origins, I think will be interesting. And people have seemed to like the histories over the years, which will remain available in their original form, of course, at DM's Guild. I just finished a book on the elves, the Aldriami for RuneQuest. Actually, I finished it. I sent it off and I've got comments, so I need to revise it a little bit. And I have a new secret project for next year, which will be a specific history for a company that's asked me to put together for them. So we need to finalize the contract, but I think we have it, and I just need to get off my butt, make the final changes, and send it to them. So those are kind of my 8 books I'm working on right now.
No shortage of work. You're a busy person. So we very much appreciate you spending some time with us and sharing your knowledge. And like I've said before, your lens on the overall history of tabletop role-playing games and then putting it into context of what we're seeing year to year is, I think, invaluable. And then speaking of which, any kind of knee-jerk predictions for 2021? Nobody likes to predict things because, usually half of it doesn't come true, if not more. But any kind of trends that you see happening?
Something that's become pretty obvious to me, and this is a really boring answer, is that a lot of the trends that we see continue from year to year. And so I think a lot of what we've seen thus far, we're going to see that into next year. I've seen this rise of the use of role-playing games as content year by year, going back at least to the middle of the 2010s. And so I think we're going to see more of that. I think we're going to see at least a couple more games get either licensed or made into TV shows or movies. I think it's going to start going beyond the big ones, Warhammer, D&D, World of Darkness. We've kind of seen those. I think we're going to see something licensed for someone else. I mean, RuneQuest Glorantha TV show, that would be pretty cool. Traveler, actual successful movie or TV show, that would be pretty neat. I think those are the types of, things just barely off of the top tier, Pathfinder that we might see a license for at least. And, that's what the hope of it. So I think we're going to see more of that. We might see more mainstream streaming like the D&D Live that was on Peacock. Within the industry, I think we're going to see a normalization of conventions. I think by the time we get to this next year's convention season, hopefully people are going to feel a little better about getting out into the world. I don't know. It seems like every year, every time people start to feel better, we have a new variant, which sets us back. I think, unfortunately, we're going to see at least one major company go out of business because of the shipping problems.
Wow. And what about for indie designers who do watch our channel here, as far as is itch going to continue to grow, or is it always going to remain a niche? Is DriveThruRPG, speaking of logistics problems, print on demand and all that kind of stuff, I wonder how it's going to affect them. And there's so many facets to all of this. Any kind of advice for indie designers?
Print on demand, I can tell you in part how it's been affected by the pandemic, which has been slowed. I mean, I'm in Hawaii, but my shipping is horrible. But I've seen print on demand take 2 to 3 months to get to me at this point. I suspect on the mainland, people are saying a month would be my guess, and a month and a half. And so it's been delayed. Indie designers, itch. I've had a hard time really assessing. It is clearly a huge creative wellspring. I mean, it's amazing to go in and see how much is being done there, how much is new and not being seen, but I'm not really seeing it in the wider world. So Itch, great test bed, great place to test ideas. If you want to get it out further, I think there needs to be a change in Itch for that to happen. And there might be. I mean, they might want to figure out how to push it further. DriveThruRPG looks to me like it still remains the place to go for digital content if you really want it at a large scale. And not necessarily if you want comments, if you're still working on revising it. So I think maybe you might say that Itch and DriveThru might not actually have the same goals and the same uses, that the one might be much better as a creative community and the other might be much better as a publishing community.
And then sadly, every year we lose a lot of great talent and people that have contributed to the industry. And maybe you can just comment on a few of those folks, and then I think I'll put together maybe a bit of a in memoriam afterwards. But maybe just talk about some of the great minds that we've lost.
Yeah, Steve Perrin was the one that really touched me because I knew him personally, not well, but he's someone that I ran into occasionally at DunderCon, which was a convention that he was one of the founders of back in must have been the 70s, and remains one of the biggest and most influential in the California Bay Area where I used to live. He created RuneQuest with friends, but in fact, if you look at the original cover, it says by Steve Perrin and friends. That means he created the basic role-playing system. That means that he created the system that was used to as the foundation of Call of Cthulhu, the most successful horror role-playing game for at least a decade before World of Darkness came out, and pretty much the game that made Lovecraftian horror a major subgenre in the role-playing industry. It means that he also was the author of Worlds of Wonder, which was kind of the system that took basic role-playing and made it into a house system for Chaosium, and included Superworld. Superworld, in turn, was the game that Jar Jar Martin ran when he was running his superhero role-playing game that eventually became the Wildcard series, which is, the series must be in its 30s in books right now. And of course, Jar Jar Martin has become a mildly well-known household name as well. I purposely underspeak that. So Steve Perrin's influence wasn't just on the role-playing industry, but on the wider media industry. He also, as I mentioned earlier, Swedish role-playing is based on basic role-playing. So you can say Steve Perrin pretty much created the entire Swedish role-playing industry, of which Frealingen is now one of the biggest role-playing companies in the world and themselves very influential. So it's Steve Perrin, I would definitely put in my 10 most influential people in the role-playing industry. And he was unassuming. I don't think ever really took up that pedestal that he was well deserving of as one of the real founders and creators of the industry. That was Steve Perrin. Richard Hallowell is someone that I did not know very well because he was the original designer of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and I've never really been a miniatures person. But he designed Warhammer Fantasy Battle. He had some co-designers. He did the original design, and then they took it in-house and did more work. And then he was one of the co-designers for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which came out a few years later. And so he was basically not only one of the people that made this hugely successful, Goliath that is Games Workshop, that is one of the, few people that has ever really competed with, Dungeons and Dragons, whether it be at TSR or Wizards of the Coast, and that still pretty much controls the miniature fantasy industry. But he also was one of the creators of this darker fantasy that, emerged in the 80s. I think Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was 86. And kind of took over the whole industry for a while. you look through the 80s and the 90s, and everyone was doing these darker fantasies, often replacing these token influenced fantasies, and that all came from Richard. And the third person that we very sadly lost that I thought of was of particular influence in the industry was Terry Ampler. So Terry was one of the founders of ICE, and so one of the creators of Rolemaster. He was the one that really turned their original Iron Wind setting into an entire world, and that was Shadow World. And it was kind of fantasy, kind of science fantasy. It had a fairly unique place in the industry. But where I thought Terry was particularly influential and important was in the 90s. He came out to White Wolf magazine in an article as a gay gamer and game designer. And that was in a time that was not necessarily safe to do at any level as a designer or just as a person in society. And so he was not just brave, but I think he really encouraged and offered a lot of younger LGBTQ people to say, hey, it's okay to be a gay gamer, and you'll be accepted just like everyone else. He was one of the first people to have a gay culture in his game, which was Shadow World. And so he's someone that's not probably as well known as Steve Perrin or Richard Hallowell, but I think his influence in bringing diversity and understanding into the industry might be just as important.
Well, Shannon, thank you for sharing your knowledge. And as we say goodbye, we'll play off some of the others that we've lost this year. And thank you for your time. And we'll see you next year.
Thank you very much. Look forward to talking to you again. Thank you for having me.